Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Hydrogen Scenario Planning. This webinar is presented by Strategic Decisions Group and Enerchemtech. And now I'd like to introduce today's first speaker, Dr. Sang-Won Kim. Sang-Won is a partner with Strategic Decisions Group and head of the Global Energy Practice. Sang-Won, you have the floor.
Thank you, Clara. Let me also extend my warm welcome to everyone who has joined us today. I would like to introduce my co-speakers who have joined us, Dr. Mauricio Davia, Managing Director and co-founder of Enerchemtech, Dr. Mitch Halpern, who is Principal Consultant, Innovation and IP, also from Enerchemtech, and Mr. Mihir Joshi, who is an Associate Consultant with SDG. For those of you who have joined us our webinar last year on navigating the complex landscape of energy transition back in November, you may remember this slide. Back then, we have presented 5 entities that shape the ongoing energy transition to a lower carbon world. We have policymakers who make the rules and provide incentives to reduce carbon in our world. There are energy producers who have to use the technologies and actually reduce the carbon as they provide energy to us. And then there are technology providers who need to develop those technologies to whether it is ways to extract the hydrogen or ways to capture and store CO2. And the financiers have a huge role to play, as the amount of investment that would be required would be something beyond our imagination. And finally, there are consumers who would eventually need to adapt to a new source of energy that are either carbon-free or near carbon-free to reach the net zero goal. Now, you may also remember that we illustrated a range of different opportunities that exist in the hydrogen world, whether it is a global shipper, whether it is a power producer, or the people in the public transportation or the transportation sector making cars and others. What we have realized was we just scratched the surface of this very complex, the world of hydrogen. So what we wanted to do today is hopefully to provide with you a practical framework to think about how hydrogen economy is going to evolve over time and how to develop your own strategies through scenario planning approach. As we begin, we would like to conduct a poll to get to know you better. Tell us your primary role related to hydrogen. First, perhaps you are directly involved in developing hydrogen technologies or work for a company that does so, or you are involved in actually investing in hydrogen-related business, whether that is in extraction or storage and usage. Maybe you are neither developing technologies or investing, but you have broader interest in the evolution of hydrogen economy. Perhaps your interest is outside of hydrogen economy, but rather broad interest in energy transition, or you may not be interested in energy transition or hydrogen. Please make your selection and let us know how you're related to hydrogen. Okay, I can see the polls coming in. As Clara mentioned, we have received a lot of questions as you registered for our webinar. So we'll try to answer those as many as we can through our question pane. And please feel free to raise questions throughout the webinar today as well. And we'll try to address as many of them as possible today, and if not today, after the webinar. Clara, let's give it a few more seconds, and please close the poll. Thank you. It looks like majority of you have either broad general interest in the evolution of hydrogen economy or general interest in energy transition. And actually some of you are actively investing in hydrogen technologies. Great, welcome again. Our webinar today will consist of 3 sections. In the first section, Mauricio is going to talk about the basic chemical properties of hydrogen as a specialty chemical and what are some of the opportunities and challenges that exist in scaling up. Mihir is going to present the overall hydrogen value chain. What are the opportunities that are associated with different parts of the value chain? And then Mitch and I are going to talk about why scenario planning approach can be useful and thinking about your own strategies to invest in hydrogen value chain. And we wrap up with conclusions. You may see a lot of headlines on hydrogen. In fact, every other headline related to energy transition seems to be taken up by hydrogen these days, whether some companies investing in technologies such as methane pyrolysis, a way to extract hydrogen, or some countries announcing their country level strategies to encourage investment in hydrogen. Not surprisingly, according to Bloomberg, by the end of this year, there would be about 50 different countries that have established and announced country-level hydrogen strategies. That is just about all of the advanced economy in the world, and majority of the countries that have set some ambitious carbon reduction targets. This also underscores the magnitude of investment and requirement for a different approach to make hydrogen a reality, which will require enormous amount of investment in terms of infrastructure and to make it a mainstream commodity. Perhaps not surprisingly, large and small energy companies have taken notice and they started actively investing in hydrogen projects. Recently, BP announced that they will be the operator and the majority owner of Asian Renewable Energy Hub project located in Australia. Total capital investment is about $30 billion, according to the Wall Street Journal. And one thing quite interesting is the footprint that this project requires. It is said that it would require about 6,500 square kilometers of space for all the solar and wind panels, solar panels and wind turbines and related infrastructure. To put that into perspective, that is about 5 times the size of Hong Kong. At the same time, there are a lot of skeptics out there as well. Let's admit that it is still very energy intensive to separate hydrogen from the natural sources. And there's a lot of doubt about whether it will ever compete as a viable competition against electric vehicle as a way to enable the consumer transportation or as a way to generate power directly. So with those, I'll turn it over to Mauricio so that he can take us back to the high school chemistry class to talk a little bit about the chemical of hydrogen. Mauricio.
Okay, so let's start by describing some characteristics of hydrogen. Hydrogen is the lightest and the simplest element in the universe, and it is also the most abundant. However, hydrogen is not usually found in its pure form because it combines easily with other elements. On Earth, hydrogen is present in many compounds and is found mostly as water, but it is also part of other compounds such as fossil fuels, fats, sugars, and many other molecules essential to life. At ambient conditions, hydrogen is a colorless, odorless, tasteless, and non-toxic diatomic gas. Now, one of the hydrogen unique characteristics is its energy density, which can be expressed in mass or in volumetric terms. And hydrogen has the highest energy density per unit of mass of any common fuel. So, for example, if we if we compare diesel or gasoline with hydrogen, hydrogen has almost 3 times as much energy content. But in terms of energy per unit volume, the energy density per unit volume, hydrogen is the lowest energy density in terms of those. So that is why one of the reasons, not the only one, but that is one of the reasons why its wide-scale use has been difficult so far. Now, if we speak about the market applications of hydrogen, its demand stems from energy storage and from its use as a feedstock for chemical and other industrial processes, as an intermediate chemical, or as a specialty chemical. And the current global hydrogen demand is estimated to be about 90 million metric tons. Next one, please. The next slide. Now, hydrogen is expected to play a key role in the energy transition towards a future sustainable energy system. However, there are challenges that need to be overcome, such as the following ones. Reducing the cost of production technologies to make hydrogen cost competitive with other conventional fuels is just one example. A large-scale supply via electrolysis will be needed, particularly for green hydrogen. Building a practically new storage, transportation, and distribution network for wide use will also be required. We have the pace of technology development to support a clean new industry in which hydrogen cannot be a bottleneck. There might be competition for resources among sectors, such as the use of electricity from renewable sectors, or water, the main element in the production of green hydrogen. And finally, there are as well several risks that need to be further understood, such as environmental, health, safety, or regulatory risks, for example. So now I would like to turn it over to Mihir to continue with the presentation.
Great, thank you, Mauricio. So the hydrogen value chain itself is constantly evolving, but at the crux of it, it is composed of three different sections, which would be the production, transportation and storage, and then consumption. So let's jump into each of these different sections and ultimately understand how they factor into scenario planning. So let's start off with hydrogen production. Now, we've all heard phrases in the news like blue hydrogen or green hydrogen or gray hydrogen, but like Mauricio mentioned, hydrogen itself is colorless. So what exactly do these colors mean? The colors typically refer to the source, in other words, what is a key component in terms of producing that hydrogen. It would also refer to the technology, how or what method we would use to produce the hydrogen, and then finally it would tell you the corresponding greenhouse gas impact. Hydrogen itself is primarily produced through electricity or through fossil fuels. On the electricity side, if you were to use, let's say, mixed origin grid power, through electrolysis, you would produce what is known as yellow hydrogen. Replace that grid power with nuclear power and you get pink or purple hydrogen. But if you use renewable forms of energy, let's say wind or solar, you produce what is known as green hydrogen. And green hydrogen is the ultimate goal here, primarily, as you can see in that final column, its GHG impacts are minimal. So that is the ultimate target. On the flip side, when looking at production using fossil fuels, there are a couple of different ways you could do so. You could use brown or black coal, and through gasification, you could produce the required hydrogen. But as you can see in that GHG column, the emissions are high. So it almost conflicts with the role that hydrogen is playing in the energy transition portfolio. You could also use natural gas instead of coal, and through a steam methane reforming process, you could produce gray hydrogen, or through pyrolysis, you could produce turquoise hydrogen. And that brings me to blue hydrogen. Now, as you can see, it still uses natural gas and coal, but its GHG impacts are low. So what is the differentiating factor between blue and some of the other ones we were talking about below? The key ingredient here is a CCUS unit. With a CCUS unit, instead of emitting gases straight into the atmosphere, we can actually capture them. And so it makes the production of hydrogen a little cleaner. And as we see the hydrogen economy evolve, blue hydrogen is viewed as a short-term solution, with green hydrogen hopefully becoming the long-term solution in terms of production. So we've talked about how we actually produce hydrogen, but now that we've produced it, how do you take it from point A to point B? That's what we'll talk about on the next slide. So when we're looking at the transportation and storage, there are primarily three considerations we need to have. Firstly, which form are we going to transport the hydrogen in? Secondly, how are we actually going to transport it? And then finally, if we need to store it, how can we store it? On the form side, you could compress the hydrogen and keep it as a gas, or you could cool it to the point that it becomes a liquid. You could also consume it and put it into an intermediary molecule, if you will, in the forms of ammonia or methanol. It is important to note that if you were to cool it and liquefy it or convert it into ammonia or methanol, there's also a recovery factor associated with it in terms of how much hydrogen you can get back from that form. In terms of transportation, pipelines and trucks are very common to transport gases in general, and ships are primarily being used as a form of international transportation. There are also other novel technologies currently being developed, and there are a lot of studies and research being done on adapting existing infrastructure to accommodate hydrogen as well. And finally, that brings me to storage. So in terms of storage, we could have physical storage. These would be things like storing it in tanks or in geological formations, or we could also have chemical storage. And again, you consume the hydrogen, produce it turn it into an intermediary form, and then when you need that hydrogen back, you recover it from that molecule. So these are the common ways of transporting hydrogen from point A to point B. But once it actually reaches point B, what can we do with it? That's what we'll talk about on this next slide here in terms of hydrogen consumption. So when we're talking about how hydrogen itself is consumed, there are a lot of different ways for hydrogen and its applications, and they're constantly being developed as well. That said, it is important to note that hydrogen has a little bit of cyclicality associated with its consumption. Starting with hydrogen right in the middle, if we go to the top left, hydrogen could be used for energy storage. That energy storage can then be used for power generation, and that power generation can then be used to produce hydrogen once again. So you could see that cyclicality there. However, there are also several non-cyclical applications. You could use it in transportation, such as cars or planes. You could convert it into fuels. You could use it in refining as an upgrading oil, or convert it into ammonia and use it as a fertilizer. It can also be used for metals refining and for heating as well. But again, these are just some of the many, many different applications that are out there. So let's move on to the next slide here and review what we were just talking about. We talked about hydrogen production. We identified 8 different production options. We identified over 8 storage and transportation options. And then we identified over 8 possible product options as well. So when we multiply these out, we are talking roughly 512 different value chain pathways. Now, granted, not all 512 will end up becoming winners, but the mere fact that there are so many different value chain pathways out there really highlights the need for scenario analysis, which will eventually allow you to position yourself accordingly to succeed as the value chain pathways develop. So with that, I'd like to move on to the next slide and ask our audience a question. We'd love to learn a little bit more about you. So Clara, if we could please open the poll here. We'd love to learn more about your biggest challenges. So what are your biggest challenges in participating in the hydrogen economy? And I'd like to request you to select up to 2, please. You can select any of the following options, which include things like, we do not have a clear objective in pursuing hydrogen, or perhaps it is hard to predict how the hydrogen economy itself will evolve. Maybe you just don't see a way to make profits with hydrogen, or there are simply too many opportunities to evaluate and choose from. And finally, maybe you just don't have the internal support at your organization to pursue hydrogen. So if you could please take a moment and answer the poll, that would be much appreciated.
Mihir, while we wait for the results, you talked about multiple different uses of hydrogen. What are some of the kind of near-term applications of hydrogen that you think will evolve that we will see more of?
Absolutely, Sangwon. So currently, in terms of hydrogen uses, refining or its purpose as an upgrading oil is very, very popular, in addition to producing fertilizers and refining metals. Those, I would say, in the United States at least, are the big 3, if you will. But we've also seen in the news things like vehicles using hydrogen, or hydrogen fuel. So I think those would be something that we'll see in the coming years as well. All right. So it looks like the votes are in. Clara, if you wouldn't mind closing the poll, please. So it's very interesting. It looks like we have an overwhelming favorite here in the second option, which is that it's hard to predict how the hydrogen economy will evolve. Well, I'm happy to inform you that you're definitely in the right place. We hope to discuss that process a little bit more and hopefully provide a little bit more clarity in terms of how you can plan for the different evolutions. So with that, I'd like to move on to the next slide and hand it over to Mitch.
Thank you, Mahir. Scenarios and the hydrogen business and technology environment. As you can see from the diagram on the left, which is already very simplified, and we'll discuss that in a bit, business and technology decisions in the hydrogen energy transition area or in any area are subject to a large variety of direct and indirect macro and micro forces in areas ranging from economics to politics to technology, international relations, culture, social change, and resource and environmental constraints. The interplay of all these factors creates a great deal of uncertainty. With uncertainty comes a great deal of risk in terms of whether or not one's strategic approach is going to be correct or not. Now, the problem here is that most conventional strategic planning approaches basically rely on conscious or unconscious assumptions of what we call a single point forecast. In your mind, as a strategic planner, you already have a view of what the future is going to look like. The only problem is there's no way you can really predict the future. And so the odds of your plan being optimal or even functional at all when push comes to shove is very unlikely. So by taking into account the high impact, high uncertainty forces that go into making these decisions, we can create various scenarios that basically describe various plausible alternative futures. This allows you to create an integrated understanding of the dynamics of change, to create a complete range of opportunities and threats, to reduce the range of elements of surprise. Even if you decide to go with a strategy that really only fits one specific scenario, at least you'll be aware of the risk and the level of surprise will decrease. You also may want to look at scenarios as a way of providing a range of strategic options to allow you to create a strategy that is functional or robust across many different scenarios and allow you to see when you are moving from one scenario to another and how that might implicate or argue for a change in your strategy. It allows you to conduct a better overall risk assessment and provides you with a way of continuously monitoring the business and technology environment to help detect, as I alluded to just a second ago, when you may be moving from one future scenario to another. Next slide. Sometimes in the scenario planning business, there is a lot of confusion about what scenarios are and what they are not. In some people's mind, scenarios are basically single endpoint snapshots or predictions of what the future is going to look like, but they really aren't. They're trying to give you alternative futures and ways to navigate between alternative futures. They're not general views. In order for your scenario planning efforts to be successful, they have to be based and address a definitive decision focus. Otherwise, you run into the problem of creating scenarios that may be entertaining and interesting, but are not particularly useful as test beds for potential technologies. You want your scenarios to contain the detailed forces that are high impact, high uncertainty, or high impact, low uncertainty that will have a direct impact on your decision, and leave out the extraneous forces that might be interesting but are second or third order. We're also in the process not trying to create sort of a general variation around a median case. We're really looking at creating a way of harnessing your staff's insight and perceptions to create alternative views of potential futures that give you a good context for evaluating strategic decisions. Next slide. This is sort of the 5-point roadmap for using a decision-focused scenario process in hydrogen strategy development or in other strategic planning efforts. Step number one, perhaps the most important step, is to select your decision focus. This keeps you from creating scenarios that are basically too general to be useful. Once you have your decision focus, you want to identify the high impact, high uncertainty, and high impact, low uncertainty forces that will impinge on that decision focus and allow you to build customized scenarios that directly address the detailed alternative futures in which your decision your decision needs to be made in terms of what kind of strategy to employ. Once you have these customized scenarios, you want to develop strategic alternatives that allow you to basically create a series of potential strategies that can be tested against the future environments that you are describing in your scenarios, and to see in which scenarios your strategies play out better than in other scenarios. And finally, you want to be able to evaluate those alternatives and decide which strategies you're going to use to address which scenarios, to create a strategy that helps you deal with uncertainty and risk.
Thank you, Mitch.
Thank
So as SDJ and Enerchem Tech, we've held multiple workshops in preparation for this webinar, and we have dedicated one of the workshops just listing all of those economic, technological, policy factors that Mitch have talked about. I think we came up about listing 70 of them. And what we did was we bucketed them under 3 different categories. Ones that are eventually judged and determined by the acceptance of the consumers in the market, ones that are driven by how quickly technology will advance, and ones that are at the hands of policymakers and people who set the rules. So what was very interesting was we not only we were seeing those uncertainties or factors that are specific to hydrogen, say efficiency of fuel cell technology, how quickly the cost of hydrogen production, extraction and separation, electrolysis would come down, or what are the specific hydrogen-specific incentives the government will provide. But there were lots of other kind of broader energy transition-related uncertainties and variables that would actually have a significant impact on the evolution of hydrogen economy. Availability of renewable energy, for example, is a very interesting one in terms of how it would impact the evolution of hydrogen. You can make an argument that if we have ready access to renewable energy where it provides the majority of the power we need, we may not need to spend a lot of effort and money in investing in extracting and transporting and using hydrogen because we already have a source. At the same time, to realize the promise of green hydrogen, as Mihir has covered, we need abundant and massive amount of renewable energy, and supposedly they have to be very affordable as well. So you can see that it could work in a couple of different ways. Very similar example of high capacity batteries for long haul trucks, whether hydrogen really will ever compete as a viable source for transportation. May depend on whether there are competing technologies, batteries, that may eliminate the need of having to have a hydrogen-based, hydrogen-fueled transportation means. Similarly, broader carbon tax, carbon tariffs, and other policy variables and uncertainties will have an impact on how quickly we will see hydrogen economy evolve and develop over time. So getting back to the process that Mitch has laid out, there are lots of uncertainties, many part because hydrogen is so abundant. There are more than 500 different pathways that the market could develop. And many of you have supported the fact that it's very uncertain how it's going to evolve over time. So we want to go back to the first part of the 5-step that Mitch has mentioned. You need to have your question identified before you think about the hydrogen economy, because otherwise you will quickly get lost. So what are some of those questions? We propose that as a quote unquote decision focus. Think about what decision you're trying to make. For example, you manage a large R&D portfolio of different technologies, and you want to have a sizable portfolio that invests in different kinds of hydrogen technologies, whether it's in production or transportation or usage. So you want to decide how you want to allocate your investment dollars among them. And depending on the question, you may only select the range of uncertainties from the previous slide really may come into play to you. Or perhaps your question is broader. You are not actually actively investing in hydrogen value chain, but you want to participate and you want to even answer the very basic question of which part of the value chain should we start and where do we invest in and why. So that could be another very valid question that you may want to ask yourself and eventually have an answer for. Perhaps you are already in electrolysis technology. You perhaps need to pivot to another technology. So in this case, if the question you're trying to answer is what electrolysis specific technology you invest in, the set of uncertainties that you would be interested in would be very specific and much more detailed, we can tell. Should I focus on specific hydrogen color out of those many colors that Mihir has mentioned? And how do I balance my investment in hydrogen technology against many other low carbon technologies out there? That's another very valid question that you may want to try to answer. So rule number one, there are lots of uncertainties to think about. So you want to have your own decision focused, agreed upon before you start the scenario process. So I'll turn it back to Mitch so that he can start pick a couple of these and then start showing us the way of how you think about your own customized scenarios. Mitch, back to you.
Thank you, San Juan. What I want to do now is to take a few minutes to illustrate two somewhat different approaches to hydrogen scenario planning. One where we're using the scenarios as a strategic test bed. I discussed this a bit a few minutes ago, when I talked about using scenarios to get a picture of how a proposed strategy might fare in each of the scenarios. That is what we're referring to. That approach is what we're referring to here as decision focus number one, in terms of what should our hydrogen R&D strategy be. You know, what technologies are important for our future business? How does the technology, the R&D programs we want to develop in hydrogen support our future strategic requirements? How can we segment our technology investments to make sure that we have a significant critical mass in key hydrogen technologies without the risk of putting all of our eggs in one basket, particularly in a highly uncertain environment? How should we obtain these technologies in terms of doing it internally or licensing it from another company or getting involved in some other kind of strategic partnership? And what does the technology roadmap look like over time for us to pursue these technologies? And how can we key the technology development into actual new product development? The other approach that we have in decision focus number two is really using the scenarios as a market test bed. So here we're going to look at how should we invest in the hydrogen value chain and look at some key questions that fall under the rubric of this particular decision focus. Basically things like, under which circumstances, if ever, will green hydrogen become a reality? What must happen in the external environment for hydrogen to become a mainstream commodity? If we're talking colors of hydrogen again, what will be the dominant color and why? Can I create value even if hydrogen does not live up to the expectations? Can I leverage my technology investment into some other related, some people call them adjacent areas, that will still allow me to make money and recoup at least some of my investment? And finally, what should my market and business strategy be with respect to the hydrogen economy? Next. As San Juan described, when we did our internal SDG Enter Chemtech workshops, we discovered that our high impact, high uncertainty forces affecting the hydrogen R&D strategy decision group themselves into three areas: technology availability, markets, and government policy regulations. We call these areas or clusters axes of uncertainty. And each of these axes of uncertainty have two extremes. In the case of tech availability, in the positive extreme in terms of the hydrogen economy, we have widespread availability of suitable technology, storage, and distribution technologies at scale. The opposite extreme, there's no availability at scale. In terms of markets, at one extreme, we have rapid growth, high growth markets, rapid adoption. In terms of the other extreme, we have only small niche markets with insufficient critical mass to really cause a market boom. In the government policies and regulation area, we have one extreme where there's more or less uniform global support for businesses and technologies that are involved in switching over to a hydrogen or predominantly hydrogen economy. Whereas on the other extreme, we have very fractured country by country here and there, half-hearted support, inconsistent, so that there's really no government coordinated international push favoring transition to the hydrogen economy. If you take a look at this from these 8 different extremes, from these 6 different extremes, 3 axes, we can create 8 scenarios that we'll see on the next slide. So here are the 8 scenarios. One of the first things you'll notice here is that we give the scenarios cute or at least memorable names. It's sort of traditional in the scenario planning area to help you remember the basics of each scenario logic. 2 of these scenarios we can eliminate because they're not particularly enlightening. And those 2 are the ones labeled not important in this table. There can't go wrong, in which the factors, the high impact, high uncertainty forces are so positive that no matter what you do from an R&D investment strategy standpoint, you're more or less guaranteed to win. The only thing you could do wrong in this scenario is not play. On the other extreme, we have the runaway scenario where everything, all the forces are so negative that no matter what you do, except to not play at all, you're pretty much bound to fail. That would leave 6 other scenarios. If you look at these 6, there are 2 that we deem to be unlikely. And in these 2 particular scenarios, you have a situation where the regulatory forces are very fractured, but the technology or market development is robust. And we consider that to be not particularly likely. So one of the things you notice here is that we're starting all the way from the beginning and looking at it from a sort of 50,000-foot view. We are taking a system with God knows how many zillions of variables and using the development of scenarios coupled with judgments of usability and likelihood to create a much narrower set of possibilities to deal with that still give us a good feel what the boundaries of uncertainty are, and thereby give us a way to come to grips with the risk and uncertainty in the hydrogen energy transition. Next, please. So this leaves us with 4 illuminating scenarios. In a real process, each of these would be much longer in terms of a description. They would be detailed stories containing most, if not all, of the high impact, high uncertainty forces and high impact, low uncertainty forces that were used to make up these scenarios. And then these would be used to help us create and evaluate strategies. Briefly, I'll describe what these 4 scenarios are and give you a quick flavor for what the R&D strategy implications are. And stuck in the lab, we have a very high degree of pent-up market demand and favorable government policies, but the technology still lags. This to us implies a dual investment strategy that addresses both the need for simple, not fully developed techs to meet some of the early stage market needs, and a more vigorous, high dollar gambit to perfect the technologies needed to address the larger applications. This could also be an area where cooperative industry, academia, and government research would be useful. In the where's the demand scenario, technology and government policies are favorable, but for various reasons, consumer acceptance lag. So really, this implies that R&D investments should be driven in areas that could be used to directly spur near-term demand. This would involve some moderate near-term investments, and there should be a platform and portfolio approach that would enable you to quickly address markets as they develop without going back and reinventing the wheel. In the can't always get what you want scenario, market demand is high, but the technology is just not ready. So this really needs an aggressive private investment strategy across a broad range of H2 of hydrogen production and application technologies. And last but not least, in premature political push, you have the market and technology developments both lag despite the impetus of favorable government policies. And this implies a focus on basic research favored by government dollars, coupled with low-level markets that can be approached relatively easily. Again, in this scenario, you would favor cooperative industry, government, and academia research. And finally, what this also indicates is that if you look at these in greater detail, as I said, you can derive even more detailed strategic benefits or limitations to various R&D approaches.
Okay.
All
right.
Back to Sang-Hwan.
All right, thank you, Mitch, and thanks for getting it down to 4. I'm thinking about all 8, it makes my head hurt. So now I want to tackle the other example, where if the key question is what part of the hydrogen value chain do you want to invest in? Very broad, the business question. So in that, I thought there are 2 kind of driving forces and main axes of scenario that you would want to think about. On the vertical axis, I picked hydrogen and also carbon capture uses in scenario technology advances. So hydrogen technology advance is kind of clear, but then I would make an argument that hydrogen technology on its own is not going to the crack in terms of hydrogen really becoming a mainstream commodity. We really need at least a technology that captures CO2 from the process of producing hydrogen and be able to transport and store properly. Because otherwise, it would still mainly be one of those darker color hydrogens. So these would encompass technologies across the entire value chain, all the way from the extraction to usage, and also capture of carbon emissions and storage. In thinking about the 2 ends of the possible worlds, on the low end, if it never takes off, it basically is a newer source where it never cracks the technology of being able to store and somehow liquefy or compress and transport, or still at relatively small scale, where it would be heavily either the dark colors or the subsidized application. On the other hand, the one world where hydrogen really takes off, the technology-wise, is the natural gas analogy. If you think about natural gas, it started as a byproduct to crude oil production, and we found ways to, instead of flaring natural gas, found ways to compress it and send it through a pipeline, eventually liquefy, compress even further, and find a way to make the global trade happen. So if we can get to a world, describe a world where hydrogen technology at the same level as the natural gas handling, I think that would be the good, kind of extreme, the other end of the hydrogen / carbon capture technology uncertainty. The other axis is the availability of economic carbon-free power. So we say specifically carbon-free as opposed to renewables. So perhaps the advance of solar panels technologies and the wind turbine may not be enough. And we may need sources like nuclear power. somehow would have to clear the political regulatory hurdles, we may really need that technology to really realize the world where we can count on carbon-free power as a base load for for our electricity needs. So that's one world, and the other world would be despite the advances in technology and in cost so far, renewables and energy mostly remain as either expensive or only available to some parts of the world or those who can afford it only. So I picked these two axes: hydrogen technology and CCUS technology advances and availability of the carbon-free power. With those, we could have seen where the gravitate towards. There are 4 different combinations that we can think of. So on the lower left is relatively not interesting, but basically hydrogen never overcome the barrier of just the specialty chemical. Is mostly darker, still very carbon intensive, local and subsidized, and would not have much contribution to the net zero ambitions. But on the other hand, if we have abundant source, ready access to carbon-free power, and hydrogen, the technology advances, then we would have actually realized the potential of the hydrogen and through the form of green hydrogen. We can conceive that perhaps this scenario would require nuclear power research, and then there may be many technologies that would make, for example, modular reactors small scale available that are combined with the extraction of hydrogen, which would which would support the evolution of pink hydrogen, for example. So this could be a scenario where hydrogen, it becomes another commodity, where we may see hydrogen listed on Chicago Mercantile Exchange with a price associated with it, just as we would natural gas or crude oil. What could be interesting is the other 2 in-between scenarios. If we have the technology for hydrogen, but if the access to renewable or carbon-free power is limited, then it becomes a luxury energy. And this is the case where regional disparity in the source of the hydrogen production in a clean format versus the need to have hydrogen and import hydrogen would be maximized. So this would, we can say this would precipitate the global trade, just as the LNG trade market has evolved. And there will be an import and export system because there is a technology to compress and transport hydrogen and matching the sources of production and the usage. In that case, you can imagine that blue may be the predominant form of hydrogen. On the other hand, if technology never gets there, but if we have renewable source as abundant the source and base loads for power, we may never need hydrogen. And one can make a case that underlying fossil fuel industry may shrink, which would not which would actually make the hydrogen production market also shrink. Anyhow, so what? So Mitch kind of dispersed the decision implications among those 4 different scenarios. The way I thought about it was there are 4 different ways, perhaps. Probably there are more that you can think about in the playing the hydrogen value chain. Perhaps you want to bet that blue hydrogen is really the way to go. So you're not sure about how the renewable technology will reduce the cost even further. You think nuclear will never be a starter. Then perhaps you want to invest in those blue hydrogen specialists, becoming a blue hydrogen specialist and be really good at the operation of such. You may want to invest in the most challenging technologies in mobilizing hydrogen, either in blending, transporting, and storing. Somebody's going to crack it, and global trade will come about as long as hydrogen technology advances. So you go for the most challenging part of the value chain. There are many companies who are already in hydrogen business, and for them, they would be incremental business. It would be companies that are already producing fertilizer and combining that with CCS to make it a blue ammonia. or companies that are already in steam methane reforming, and they combined it with CCS, or are trying to really maximize the efficiency of technologies that they already have, such as electrolyzer. And finally, kind of pivoting away from the hydrogen and investing in adjacent markets and technologies. So these are the possible ways to play in the hydrogen, depending on your belief about the future scenarios that we have presented. Now I will, with the interest of time, I will turn it over to Mauricio to have a final poll of the webinar today. Mauricio?
Okay, now we invite you to participate in another poll, and we thank you for that. We would like to ask the following question: which step of the scenario planning process is most difficult in your organization? Please select one. Is it, for example, selecting a decision focus? Or is it identifying the driving forces to build scenarios with? Perhaps fully describing each scenario is a step that your organization will find it difficult? Or is it developing decision implications and alternatives? So if you don't mind taking a little time to answer the poll, we would appreciate it.
Okay. See the answers coming in. But what are typically the difficult points that we see that our customers spend the most time on or having the most difficulties with? Mitch, what is that like from your experience?
In my experience, selecting the decision focus and figuring out after you basically brainstorm all of the driving forces, how to put them together to form the best, quote unquote, combination of axes of uncertainty.
All right, that's interesting. Not that we want to influence the answers in any way, but that would be good to share our experience. Thank you.
Okay, so let's share the results. There, they came already, and I see that developing decision implications or identifying the driving forces to build scenarios are the most important ones. But there are also difficulties on the other elements or steps of the scenario planning process that appears as well for some of you. So that is why we decided to run this webinar, so that you and your organizations become more familiar with using the scenario planning process to develop winning hydrogen strategies. So let's go to that last one, to conclusions, to wrap up. And here we want to say that there are 3 key takeaways that you need to keep in mind when considering scenario planning. Hydrogen, as we presented, is a key component in the ongoing energy transition, but the evolution of the hydrogen economy still faces significant uncertainty. Hydrogen production and distribution at scale will also unlock many value creation opportunities along the whole value chain, but multiple hurdles have to be overcome in order for hydrogen to realize its full potential. And finally, scenario planning can help us paint a broad picture of the hydrogen economy evolution, and it can help us as well create decision-focused scenarios to better understand decision implications and guide strategy development. So let me just turn it over now to Sangwon for some final remarks.
Yep, sure. Thank you. Hopefully you took away some practical tips in thinking about your own hydrogen business strategy. One thing that we would suggest is you can accomplish the first 3 steps of the process that Mitch laid out in a 2-day scenario workshop. You would start out on the first day kind of agreeing on the decision focus among the participants for your business or organization, and then spend the afternoon on the first day basically listing all of the uncertainties and identifying the ones that really matter to the decision focus that your team has agreed on. And you can come back on the next day, take some time to kind of build out those customized scenarios. As Mitch has illustrated, you don't have to map out all of the possible combinations, but you can pick and choose the ones that are most interesting and perhaps provocative for you. And then you can wrap up with insights and next steps. It probably won't give you enough time to think about the range of strategic alternatives that really should be the next step, but it would be a good way to jumpstart the process of developing hydrogen strategy for your business. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining and staying through the end of the webinar. I will now turn it back to Clara to wrap us up. Clara?
Great, thank you, San Wang, and thank you to all of our presenters.